Violent riots that broke out in the United Kingdom in recent weeks appear to have been subdued. The riots started following the spread of misinformation about a knife attack that killed 3 girls in an English town. British police say they have arrested more than 1,000 people around the country after anti-immigrant mobs clashed with police, attacked mosques and overran some hotels housing asylum seekers. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer strongly condemned the riots.
This is not protest. It is organised, violent thuggery, and it has no place on our streets or online.
The riots also prompted counter-protesters. The anti-racism campaigners filled the streets of towns across the country, carrying signs that read "Refugees Welcome" and "Stop the Far Right." But the challenge of addressing the underlying causes of the riots still remains. Andrew McDougall is a director at Trafalgar Strategy, a UK-based strategic communications consultancy. He also contributes political columns for several publications, and he joins me now. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on, JP.
So in your recent piece about the riots, you wrote, "Something like this has felt inevitable for some time." Why were you expecting an uprising like this in the UK? What were some of the key stress points that delivered this sort of violence and unrest?
Yeah, I think that in short, Brexit was the big warning in that the political establishment asked a very straightforward question in response to what was a very complicated problem at the time. And the British people chose a result that caught the establishment by surprise. And more to the point, in the intervening, and I guess now it's been 8 years, the promised land hadn't arrived. And there was still a lack of economic opportunity. There was still an inability of the British government to get a grip on immigration, and the attitudes of the British public were still manifestly on side with doing more. And once that wasn't done, and once there was a big enough spark to light the fire, we saw that fire go up.
You noted in your piece, too, that there were, virulent racists, there were some hateful people among the rioters, but you note that, well, many people who support a harder line on immigration are, not necessarily racist monsters. Tell me about that dynamic. There are very unsavory and even criminal elements, to be sure, in all of this, but that's not the whole story.
No, it's not. And they're the ones that get the attention because they're on the front line. They're the ones that are being the nastiest on the streets. And the problem for all politicians everywhere in advanced Western economies right now is separating that violent tip from the undercurrent that's there. And you have to, if people don't feel they're listened to, they will take action into their own hands. And if you look at polling here, and consistently for the last 5 to 7 years, it's about 60% of Brits who think that immigration is too high. And if you look at polling out in the regions outside of London, there's been a similar number that have said the government's failing them on economic opportunity. Now you put those two things together, and that's a lot of people that are feeling upset with the status quo. And even though they're not racist, even though they're not the ones lighting things on fire in the street, they're the ones that look at the world and go, yeah, something's not quite right. And even if I don't feel like those guys that are out in the streets, I'm still feeling pretty unhappy.
There's that strong majority that want fewer newcomers to come. And they've also kind of made that known, right? Like, as you said, they voted for Brexit. They handed Boris Johnson a massive majority government to get Brexit done, to end the free movement of EU citizens. But the government hasn't delivered in recent months on stopping the migrant boats across the English Channel, right? Immigration is up. It's up massively. I think it's doubled over the last number of years in the UK. So what's going on here? Why are they not actually implementing a plan that so many voters say they want?
Well, I think the short answer is that it's not doable. So if you look at the number of legal immigrants coming, as you note, that has skyrocketed. And that is because there are enormous gaps in the labor market here. And there are over 1 million Brits that could be working but aren't through ill health. And the point of fact is, if you were to stop that legal immigration, things like the National Health Service, the social care system, bars and restaurants would be woefully short-staffed. And no politician has had the guts to look at the British public in the eye and go, we need these numbers for reasons X, Y, Z. They just say, the very simplistic, we will stop the boats, we will get a grip on legal migration, knowing that they can't and probably shouldn't if they want the economy to keep growing. So it's a lack of honesty. And as I was saying before, if you lie to people for long enough, eventually they'll get upset and they'll get frustrated, and things like what we've seen for the past few weeks in Britain will happen.
We're seeing sort of a similar dynamic in Canada as well, that voters want one thing and they're kind of getting another. I mean, 60% of Canadians too want immigration to be less, if we're to believe some of the recent polls that we've seen here. But also on healthcare, right? Healthcare routinely a number one issue for people when they're thinking about who they're going to vote for, and yet 6.5 million Canadians don't have a family doctor. People say they want more homes and cheaper homes, and yet housing starts have been, essentially stagnant for the last 2 years. We're not actually building many more homes despite all these new government programs to make that happen. There seems to be a disconnect between what people want and what governments and democracies are delivering or are capable of delivering, and it seems like that's kind of a toxic combination.
Yeah, it is. And no more so in recent times than on housing. I think everybody has become accustomed to growing up in a world where they can do better than their parents did. That's been the promise of our societies. And I think that promise is now being broken. And governments around the world have been slow to adapt to the realities of the world, and that national governments don't control all the levers anymore. It's not always within their gift to fix a problem, whether that's the global migration of capital, of people, the impact of climate change and the environment on local countries, as we're seeing with wildfires in Canada. These are all things that take global coordination. That means they're harder to solve than if you just implement one policy in Canada in the hopes of fixing things. And added to that, you've had this accumulation over 30, 40 years during broadly the era of globalization, where there's been a lot of impacts on a lot of communities that politicians have glossed over because the overall numbers were getting better. GDP was going up, but that obscured some very real deficits in parts of the country, and those haven't been addressed either. And yeah, when people feel that progress isn't possible and that promises aren't being kept after they've been made by politicians, that is a recipe for change. And that's something I think Justin Trudeau is feeling the sharp end of these days.
There's that organic anger and frustration with the lack of progress, but there are also elements, particularly online, that are whipping up some of these sentiments, right? And kind of marshaling people to be more angry, perhaps even more violent. I don't always quote Prince Harry on things, but he was out this week talking about the role of social media with the riots in particular, saying that the problem is these sort of platforms have been able to spread lies, abuse, harass. They've threatened social cohesion because we essentially allow anything to be said online, and there's no real guardrails, there's no real regulatory framework around it. Do you share his concerns that some of these events, like what we're seeing in the UK, the riots, are being whipped up by social media and kind of unrestrained platforms?
Absolutely. The industry of news has great power historically, but also great responsibility. And that was to be accurate and carried the liabilities for getting that wrong. That regime does not exist on social media. And as we saw with the riots, it was one critical piece of misinformation that circulated early, namely the name of a Muslim man who somebody online claimed was an asylum seeker being behind 3 horrific murders in a community called Southport. And it was that it was a Muslim asylum seeker that was apparently behind this heinous murder that set off a lot of the riots. And it was absolutely false. And that false tweet was amplified by far-right activists like Tommy Robinson, but also by Russian state media sources. And that is the kind of propagation, the accelerant, I called it in my piece, that really can take a small fire and spread it everywhere all at once. And societies just aren't ready for that ease of transmission of unverified information. It takes a lot of work and effort to confirm and verify information. And we're just not patient enough because we expect everything to happen now. And we're hooked into these platforms who, by the way, make their money by ensuring that we stay on their platforms for as long as we can. And guess what does that? Sensational content. And that's maybe not the definition of news, but it is the definition of much of what's on these platforms.
All right, let's leave it there. Andrew McDougall in London. Thanks for coming on, sir.
Thank you for having me.